Hello, TRANSACT attendees. Welcome to the following session, Credit Card Surcharging and Merchant Acquiring During the COVID Recession. In this session, we'll be sharing some analysis on the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on surcharging, as well as best practices for offering a surcharging solution in the current environment. My name is Alicia Muth, and I'm the Director of Market Intelligence at the Straw Hacker Group. Today, I have the privilege of talking to Jonathan Ratzi. Jonathan is the CEO of CardX, which is a technology company that provides turnkey, fully compliant credit card surcharging solutions for ISOs, ISVs, and processors. Before we get started, Jonathan, can you please give a quick introduction of yourself and CardX?
Thanks, Alicia. I'd be happy to. And I want to thank you again for working with me on this. It's great to collaborate again. I was trained as a lawyer, and I've always been interested in my career in what I would call the intersection of technology and regulation. And that's exactly the kind of opportunity that credit card surcharging is. When the surcharging rules came out, I looked at the space and I thought this had huge broad-based support as a policy. I've sometimes said it might be the only policy supported by both Elizabeth Warren and the Cato Institute. But I knew it wasn't going to go anywhere as a product unless someone lowered that compliance barrier to entry. So I thought that was an interesting opportunity. I thought it was a good fit for my background and my training. And CardX now is doing just that. We're positioned as a equal parts a reg tech company and a payments company, and we deliver software solutions for credit card surcharging.
Great. Thank you very much for sharing. So let's start and jump into some of the questions. So, for those of you who might be hearing about this subject for the first time, Jonathan, can you please tell us in a few words what is credit card surcharging and how does it differ from cash discounting?
Sure. Surcharging is when a business passes on the processing fee when the customer chooses a credit card. And I think the conversation in our industry has really crystallized around surcharging. That's my point of view. So, in contrast to other models for passing on the fee, when you think about the way a merchant, in my experience, wants to quote their prices, if they're saying my price is $10 with a 3.5% fee if you choose credit, that's surcharging. And that's what's really catching on. In contrast, a true cash discount would be actually reducing that $10 price, which we don't see very often. And in terms of market direction, I would also say we talk to a lot of acquirers, large acquirers who in their product teams and compliance teams and partnership teams, they're considering how do they meet the demand to offset processing costs. They're hearing it from conferences like this one. And they're now having that conversation in terms of compliance surcharging.
Interesting. So, at last year's ETA TRANSACT, you participated in the surcharging panel. And we know the world has obviously changed quite a bit since then. And we've seen the striking effects of the pandemic in the payments industry. How would you say the new normal with COVID-19 has affected the surcharging model?
That's a great question. The world certainly has changed a lot. And what we did ahead of our session today, we worked with our in-house analyst and really dug deep into the effect of coronavirus on our merchant base. So we'd love it if we could bring up the slides now. And just while we're on this title slide, it should say merchant impact data. I was simply going to say two words of context as we're going to look through these slides together. The first is these are same store sales. So what we really wanted to find out is how has coronavirus affected our existing merchant base? So the methodology is if they were live with us before coronavirus, how has the pandemic affected their business? So this is excluding any new sales, which of course continue to be strong, but we're going to set those to the side in order to really get that picture for how are these merchants being affected. And finally, in the last word of context I'll give is in terms of verticals, where CardX focuses are commercial verticals. So you're going to see the impact on B2B, the impact on professional services. Historically, we've not focused a lot on restaurant and retail, although I really applaud some of the great data that's coming out about that space. It's not something we're in a position to share because that's not our focus area, but we think we have a great and complementary perspective in terms of these commercial verticals, and that's what we can jump into now. So let's go to the next slide. And so this first slide we're looking at is transaction count. And I'm just going to make my window a little bit larger so I can help read these numbers out to you. This is probably the most severe statistic we're going to look at together in terms of how coronavirus has affected these merchants. Transaction count, of course, down significantly. If you remember, it was March 11th that coronavirus is declared a pandemic, and you see a very steep decline in number of transactions at these merchant locations in this cohort. At its worst, down more than 40%, down 41%, in fact, by April 1. And what's interesting to see is it has, to some extent, rebounded. And now, here at May 1, we're looking at it's 75% of what it was at the beginning of March. So interesting to see transaction count. But if we go to the next slide now, we're going to see that one thing that's been a lot more resilient, and here's where the story starts to get interesting in my book, is transaction volume. So you see it's actually stayed a lot more robust than transaction count. And so same store sales as of May 1st have rebounded to 97% of that volume they had at March 1st. Now that's very interesting because if you just look at that number, you say it's 3% off, it looks like it's about the same. We know virtually nothing is the same. We're living very different lives than we were on March 1st. So what's underlying this statistic, we think, is actually some really interesting changes in behavior that account for why this volume has stayed so resilient. Now let's go to the next slide and take a look at what that is. And here you go. To me, this is one of the most striking changes in behavior over the course of this pandemic. Average ticket size for credit cards has skyrocketed. Very soon after this was declared a pandemic, again, that's March 11th, you see on that x-axis, credit card ticket size, again, that's the average amount of a credit card transaction, shot up and stayed high, has consistently stayed around that 50% up mark, so 150% of what it was when this started. That's a real change in behavior. Now, debit cards have stayed a little bit more steady, have gone up a little bit more modestly, but we really see this graph telling us that cardholders are using credit as a tool to make it through this crisis. And their average ticket size for us, it's now actually in the high $600 range, which is considered a pretty high ticket in the industry. You see those average tickets speaking to how they're using credit cards as a tool to smooth out perhaps decline in income. So let's take a look at the next slide. And again, the impact of that high ticket, you now see it in volumes when you drill down and separate credit versus debit. And credit, of course, a very different trajectory than debit, now correlated, but definitely credit cards buffered by that high transaction average amount, that high ticket. So credit cards as of May 1st are actually up 3% in volume against same store sales as compared to March 1st. So we think that's a pretty interesting story. Debit cards down 9% as of March 1st, but a pretty interesting graph to look at, we think. If we go to the next slide, this is something I think a lot of us have intuited or heard in the industry. Volume has shifted to card not present. So you see card present volumes there on the lower part of this graph have degraded. It makes sense with all the stay-at-home advisories that are still going on in this period, right? It only ends May 1st, but that card not present shows that a lot of that purchasing has shifted to Moto and e-commerce. And by the way, if all you did was focus on card not present, your same store sales are actually up 16% over this period of time. So we think that's a pretty revealing figure. And let's take a look at the next slide. And this is actually drilling down into card not present transaction volume. So you're just looking at card not present here, but slicing that into credit versus debit. And you see again, credit card. So this is that same dynamic we were talking about, but even more pronounced. Those new high ticket amounts, ticket sizes going up that shift to card not present. So you see credit card volumes and card not present are actually up to 119% of what they were at the beginning of the period we're looking at, what they were at March 1st. And so the question we ask is, does this indicate a new normal? And just to summarize a few of the points we've seen in these slides. So you've seen a shift to card not present. You've seen a big increase in ticket size for credit cards. So a shift from debit to credit, especially evidenced by that high ticket for credit. And Alicia, I'd love to hear what you think, how you react to this.
Yeah, this is very different or very interesting for sure. Thank you for sharing. The shift to card not present is probably not surprising. The fact that people are relying on credit, definitely interesting. Are there any additional conclusions that you and the team have drawn from this data?
Sure. You know, the way that we look at this is cardholders are relying on credit more heavily than before to finance their purchases and to preserve liquidity. So we hear people saying, and this is that commercial purchasing context again, and we hear people saying, look, we have cash on hand, but we want to hold on to it. So instead of using a debit card, which we may have done previously in these uncertain times, we're going to switch to a credit card. That's a good thing that they have that option to preserve liquidity and finance purchases, but it's driving up processing costs for merchants at a time that many merchants can least afford it. So for us, we see surcharging as that perfect middle path because it allows a merchant to continue offering that important credit card option. And in some ways, that option is more important than ever before, as these statistics show, but they eliminate the cost of that credit card option. So we think it's, again, that perfect middle path responding to these changed circumstances.
Interesting. So, do you think that these shifts that you were just describing in surcharging are going to be a temporary situation, or will they be more lasting as we move to a more stable state with this
It's a
pandemic?
fair question. I think some of these statistics may return to normal, but it may be gradual. I saw a piece in Bloomberg the other day stating that American cardholders still have $3 trillion of open credit on their credit cards. So I think you could continue seeing cardholders use credit cards to make it through this crisis, to smooth out declines in their own income or to feel a little bit more confident in uncertain times. Similarly, for as long as this economic environment lasts, I think you'll also see merchants, if they're seeing declines in their own growth, they're seeing their sales slowing down, they're going to be pushing very hard to eliminate expenses and to eliminate credit card costs. So for the sales force out there, perhaps listening to this session, I think it recommends a strategy in terms of keeping your selling strategy very responsive to this new environment. And I think that might be, Alicia, to your question, one of the most durable aspects of this crisis that you're seeing merchants recognize they need to take cards. They also need to take cards online, but they need to manage the cost of accepting cards. And I think more familiarity and more exposure to the surcharging option is really going to come out of this. I think this crisis, those combined factors we just talked about, have the potential of pushing surcharging into the mainstream even more so.
That makes sense. If we take the pandemic out of the mix and set it aside, what are some of the other major milestones that have been occurring in the surcharging space over this last year?
Sure. I will call out two in particular. The first is the national transformation we've seen where states are overturning legacy no surcharge laws. That's continuing. So, one of the important milestones of this last year occurred in December was that we initiated a process that resulted in an official opinion letter from the state of Oklahoma, allowing us to serve that state. So, adding another state to the map, of course, is an important milestone. And now surcharging is in 94% of the country. Another milestone I'll call out is that whereas our business, and I think the surcharging space generally, has started off strong years back in SMB, a lot of small and medium sized business adopters. Over this last year, we have seen middle market and large enterprise merchants come onto the surcharging option for the first time. And we think that's great for the robustness of this market, that now household names in particular verticals are surcharging. So that's a second milestone that I'd call out.
Very interesting. If you take a look at the regulatory strategy, how do you see that playing out over the next few years? And how does the regulatory strategy interact with market trends?
Sure. As you know, part of our overall strategy at CardX is to work with the AGs, the attorneys general of all the states that still have legacy no surcharge laws. So, as we just mentioned, that's a strategy that works. It's a strategy we're going to continue doing. So, we're very confident we're going to see surcharging in all 50 states over the course of perhaps the next year or two or three. You raised an interesting point when you mentioned how does the market trend interact with what we're doing on the regulatory front. And it's consistently surprised me and it actually encouraged me that in conversations with lawmakers and regulators, probably the most salient aspect to them, they're always asking me, are there merchants in my state that want to be doing this? And if so, what kind of businesses are they and what are their stories? And similarly, okay, if I'm a cardholder and I go online to pay one of these merchants or walk into the store, what is that experience like? How does the solution work? And in fact, they're very glad to hear some of the customer friendliness and transparency aspects that are built into the solution. So those sort of real world or on the ground facts, I think have carried a lot of weight. So I think how surcharging is playing out in fact, meaning how we're all out there selling it and serving merchants with it has been one of the most important contributing factors to the fact that it's being approved and accepted in more and more of the country. And as I said, currently 94%.
That's great. So, taking a deeper look at the market, what does this look like for B2B, card not present? And what do the merchants look like in these spaces when looking at this
Yes,
option?
definitely. You mentioned a couple of the important groups, no doubt about it. B2B, card not present. Our portfolio trends pretty heavy in card not present. Uh, when you think about it conceptually, surcharging is a great fit if a merchant has a high average ticket, if they take a lot of credit cards relative to debit cards, and if they operate with slim profit margins. So some merchants that sort of fit that description would be in insurance or industrials, technology, professional services, law, medical accounting, contractors. Those are all great fits for surcharging. In contrast, it may not be a fit for merchants with small average ticket. As you know, the card brand rules set a maximum surcharge rate of 4%. So if you sell a $2 transaction size, the surcharge couldn't exceed 8 cents. And that's unlikely to reliably offset your cost. So not a good fit for example, a convenience store. And Alicia, you and I have spoken about before, and you know I believe that for restaurants that use tip adjustments, surcharging introduces extra steps. And I'm a big believer in frictionless. So for me, that has not been a great fit previously. But beyond those exceptions, I think it's a great fit for a lot of businesses, including businesses looking to accept credit cards for the first time. If they've held off in former times because of the cost, now they have an option that allows them actually to accept credit cards and give that customer convenience for the first time. And we see surcharging actually being very pro card in that respect, that merchants in B2B are now finally able to extend that option to their cardholders.
That's great. And I'm sure it applies to other businesses too that have been reluctant to accept credit cards due to cost, which is a huge factor at times.
Definitely.
So, as far as industry observers go, many people want to know how cardholders themselves have reacted to surcharging, and then from the merchant perspective, how how do you think this interaction with the card holder is best managed?
Yeah, a lot of people have asked that question. What I'll tell you is based on our experience, the real pain point in surcharging is not customer reception. The real pain points are in compliance and operations because customer reception goes over really well if you follow what we consider best practices. So, for example, the merchant should make sure that the surcharge is transparently disclosed to the customer. There should never be any element of surprise. There should never be confusion. And by the way, if you're choosing the right provider, whether it's in partnership, if you're in the industry, or as a merchant in terms of who's doing the solution, they will take care of these aspects for you. But the first would be transparently disclosed. The second would be the customer should be aware that debit cards are a no fee option. So they should know they have an option if they don't want to pay that additional fee. And furthermore, they should also know that the merchant, when they come to passing on that credit card cost, they're only passing on what they pay to us as the provider, meaning the merchant's not profiting from the fee. That's a very important element in terms of customer reception. And the final piece that I would say is it's not mandatory, but we think it's a good practice. If you have repeat clientele, we recommend announcing the surcharging solution in advance to them. So especially for our large merchants that have an implementation timeline, maybe 30 or 60 days before going live with the solution, let them know you're choosing a surcharging solution. Let them know why, because generally in our industry, the cost keeps going up, but you want to keep your prices competitive and you want to introduce new choices. Let them know what options they have to avoid that fee. And we think that'll go over great. So those are some of the aspects I'd mentioned. And actually, there are, for example, if people are interested, they can reach out to me and get some template messaging for an announcement like that one.
That's great. Thank you. So, for ISOs, agents, and acquirers who are considering offering surcharging for the first time, what are some key points of advice that you would give to them?
Yeah, Alicia, and I think there are probably more in that category than ever before, meaning ISOs or agents or processors looking at surcharging. So I would say the following. Transparently speaking, I think a lot of companies, the trend has been that companies are becoming very partnership driven in order to get a surcharging solution. That's even the case at some of the acquirers we partner with. They know payments extremely well, but they want to bring in a reg tech provider for those elements that they think they'll benefit from a partnership for. Additionally, I would say if you're looking at this option and deciding where to go, the first thing to solve for is the compliance overhead. The extensive card brand rules that apply to this option, which we think should be performed automatically by software on behalf of the merchant. And of course, that extensive state law landscape that has changed multiple times a year historically, and we think is going to keep changing, like we were talking about earlier. But right after that compliance pain point that you got to solve for are these significant operations and IT challenges of surcharging. So make sure you're also considering those. There should be a great setup experience. There should be great reconciliation reporting tools. It should work just as well in Moto and e-commerce as it does in card present. And actually, surcharging for certain technology reasons that we can get into on another time, much harder to do in the card not present context. So make sure you're doing all of those. And those are some of the few words of advice I'd have.
Interesting. I'm looking forward to discussing the card not present environment at some point in the future. So, Jonathan, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Do you have any additional closing comments?
Well, I'd simply like to say thanks again, Alicia. I had a great time. And I want to also thank our attendees, of course, as well as ETA. They took on a big challenge on a very short timeline, taking this great conference, bringing it digital for all of us. So thanks to them for what they did. And thanks to all the attendees for supporting them.
Of course, yes. Thank you, ETA. And for the audience listening in, thank you very much for your time today. If there are any questions, please feel free to reach out. If you could pull up the slide, yep, it's showing. Jonathan's contact information is on there, as well as mine, and we'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.